This is the land controlled by the Kingdom of Macedon prior to 359 BC. And this is the land controlled by the Kingdom of Macedon merely 36 years later in 323 BC. A single man largely was the catalyst of such a dramatic expansion. A man who, to this day, is still widely considered the greatest general, field marshal, and military mind to ever live. This was Alexander III of Macedon, better known to history as Alexander the Great. It is impossible to properly tell the story of Alexander without first introducing his father. Philip II of Macedon stands as a titan of the ancient world, who, to some, in his own distinct way, was equally as great as his more celebrated son. The ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, who is perhaps our primary source on the life of Philip, tells us, "For Philip was a king over the Macedonians for 24 years, and having started from the most insignificant beginnings, built up his kingdom to be the greatest of the dominions in Europe. And having taken over Macedonia, when she was a slave to the Illyrians, made her mistress of many powerful tribes and states. And it was by his own valor that he took over the supremacy of all Hellas, with the consent of the states, which voluntarily subordinated themselves to his authority. And these deeds he accomplished, not by the favor of fortune, but by his own valor. For King Philip excelled in shrewdness in the art of war, courage, and brilliance of personality." His story, like Alexander's, begins in Macedon, and its capital, Pella, a wild but developing hinterland on the northern periphery of the more sophisticated and cultured world of the Greek city-states. A hard and rugged place in which they did not dilute their wine with water, a practice which the Greeks considered barbaric. And the succession of the crown was usually decided by regicide, a crime so common among the Macedonians that it almost seems one step away from being institutionalized. Far from being uniquely wild within the context of the region, the Macedonians were surrounded on multiple sides by the tribes of barbarians of the Balkans. The royal family of Macedon were known as the Argead dynasty. The term Argead was used because their line were originally Dorian Greeks from the Greek city-state Argos. 3 brothers of the Temenid line were banished from the city. They were said to be descendants of the legendary king of Argos, Temenus, who, himself, was said to be a descendant of Heracles. Now, being cast out of their homeland, they first came to Illyria, and from there they wandered to the highlands of the region known as Macedonia. Slowly, they expanded their power and influence, until a kingdom, the nascent kingdom of Macedon, was formed. Now, let us examine for a moment the chaos and perpetual bloodshed that was Macedonian succession. Philip's father, Amyntas III, became king by assassinating his predecessor. Once in power, there was a plot to assassinate Amyntas, orchestrated by his wife, who had taken up with her son-in-law. When Amyntas' daughter, incensed at the betrayal, informed the king, he thwarted the attempt. However, he pardoned his wife and allowed her to live, since she was the mother of some of his children. His son, Alexander II, brother to Philip, inherited the throne. And he was assassinated by Ptolemy, who became the regent of the young heir Perdiccas, brother of the now-deceased Alexander II. When Perdiccas grew up, he assassinated Ptolemy, and thus gained autonomy over his own rule, becoming Perdiccas III. Perdiccas was then killed while on campaign in 359 BC against the Illyrians. This complex, bloody, and sordid tale typified the Macedonian condition. Perdiccas' son, Amyntas IV, ascended to the throne, but as he was a child, Philip was charged with serving as his regent. He would not relinquish his rule for the remainder of his life. Now Philip had spent time in his youth as a hostage of the Thebans, a common diplomatic arrangement of the aristocracies at that time. During this captivity, the young prince received military instruction and education from Epaminondas, a famed Theban general, and the foremost military mind of his day in Greece. whose praises, by the likes of Xenophon and Cicero, resound through the ages. He was the architect of the victory of the Battle of Leuctra, where, by arranging his infantry in oblique order, that is, by overloading the depth of his left flank, and by echeloning his weaker right and center in order to prevent them from being overrun, he smashed the famed Spartan army and forever ended the era of Spartan land dominance in Greece, elevating Thebes as the foremost Greek power. Theban military tactics had also enjoyed a more robust use of cavalry than had been common in mainland Greece, where it was still somewhat an unfocused novelty in these days prior to the advent of the stirrup. And since Macedon had long been good horse country, Philip, once freed from his captivity, back among the Macedonians and acting as their leader, saw an opportunity to incorporate bleeding-edge infantry techniques with the inherent military advantage of his homeland. After Amyntas III had been defeated by the Illyrians and forced to pay tribute to his conquerors, the Illyrians, who had taken Philip, the youngest son of Amyntas, as a hostage, placed him in the care of the Thebans. They in turn entrusted the lad to the father of Epaminondas and directed him both to keep careful watch over his ward and to superintend his upbringing and education. Since Epaminondas had as his instructor a philosopher of the Pythagorean school, Philip, who was reared along with him, acquired a wide acquaintance with the Pythagorean philosophy. Inasmuch as both students showed natural ability and diligence, they proved to be superior in deeds of valor. Of the two, Epaminondas underwent the more rigorous tests and battles, and invested his fatherland almost miraculously with the leadership of Hellas, while Philip, availing himself to the same initial training, achieved no less fame than Epaminondas. Diodorus Siculus. Philip had inherited a mess. Macedon was in a state of total chaos. Undaunted, he set about consolidating his power by way of powerful oration and oily persuasion, and drastic and innovative military reform. Warfare in ancient Greece had long been focused on contests between heavy infantries. These heavy infantries were composed of hoplites, who wielded round aspis shields, and medium-length thrusting spears known as doru. Broadly inspired by Epaminondas, but more specifically inspired by the Athenian general Iphicrates' preferred equipment and use of heavy infantry, Philip greatly lengthened their spears, which became the sarissa, and reduced the size of the shield, now known as the Telamon shield, so that it could be easily wielded while still using both hands to handle the now more ponderous pike. He also deepened the phalanx from the 8 to 16 lines of the Greek phalanx to a 16 to 32-man deep arrangement, an innovation inspired by Epaminondas' oblique order victory at Leuctra. And so, the Greek hoplite was replaced by Philip's Macedonian phalangite. These units obviously had much greater range with their weapons, and their added depth gave them more strength with which to push than the hoplites, and therefore were superior to them when opposing phalanxes would face off head-to-head. However, the obvious weakness of the Greek hoplite phalanx had always been its flanks and its rear. For whereas the heavy phalanx, when pressed on the enemy, was durable and irresistible, it was not maneuverable, was difficult to turn, and when its cohesion was lost, was hard, if not impossible, to reform. These shortcomings were greatly exacerbated by this new ideation, which doubled down not only on the Greek phalanx's strengths, but also its vulnerabilities. It was the right flank most of all that was a glaring point of exposure. This was because the Greeks held their shields in their left hands and their spears in their right, meaning that the most extreme right of the phalanx was unprotected by a comrade's shield. In an effort to exploit this, along with the natural inclination not to thrust across one's own body, the phalanx, while trying to accommodate this reality and simultaneously maintain its coherence, would tend to wander to the right, a phenomenon known as right flank drift. In order to prevent this, and compensate for the inherent weakness of the position, the most experienced, proven, and competent of an infantry's troops would be placed there, while the greener ones would be placed nearer the more protected left flank. All of this is meant to illustrate just how exposed the right flank of a phalanx was, and how crucial to a battle its protection, or conversely, its exploitation was. For if the right flank, in particular, of a phalanx was turned, the once mighty phalanx would be completely helpless and routed or slaughtered. In order to ameliorate this, the weakest point of his entire army, Philip had an elite unit, the Hypaspists, armed in a similar manner to the more traditional, more mobile Greek hoplite. set up on the Macedonian phalanx's right flank with the primary purpose of securing it. The left flank was less exposed and only required the protection of heavy cavalry. More on that later. As for light infantry, like many in Greece at this time, Philip had adopted the use of peltasts, light skirmishing units originally from Thrace, who were armed with javelins and crescent shields, excelled in harassing enemies, irritating their formations, covering withdrawals, fighting on uneven ground, and defending the flanks of the heavy cavalry. Again, more on that later. In addition to these changes to strategy and equipment, Philip also greatly increased the sheer numbers of his forces. Once brought into the ranks, he made the army into a well-trained, full-time professional force, and greatly increased their drilling, along with the duration and rigors of their training. Through these actions, Philip sought to change Macedon's fortunes, and prevent it from becoming prey, by building it into a great power. But when Perdiccas III was defeated in a great battle by the Illyrians and fell in the action, Philip, his brother, who had escaped from his detention as a hostage, succeeded to the kingdom, now in a bad way, for the Macedonians had lost more than 4,000 men in the battle, and the remainder, panic-stricken, had become exceedingly afraid of the Illyrian armies, and had lost heart for continuing the war. About this time, the Paeonians, who lived near Macedonia, began to pillage their territory, showing contempt for the Macedonians, and the Illyrians began to assemble large armies and prepare for an invasion of Macedonia, while a certain Pausanias, who was related to the royal line of Macedon, was planning with the aid of the Thracian king to join the contest for the throne of Macedon. Similarly, the Athenians too, being hostile to Philip, were endeavoring to restore Argias to the throne, and had dispatched Mantius as general, with 3,000 hoplites and a considerable naval force. The Macedonians, because of the disaster sustained in the battle, and the magnitude of the dangers pressing upon them, were in the greatest perplexity. Yet, even so, with such fears and dangers threatening them, Philip was not panic-stricken by the magnitude of the expected perils, but, bringing together the Macedonians in a series of assemblies, and exhorting them, with eloquent speeches, to be men, he built up their morale, and, having improved the organization of his forces, and equipped the men suitably with weapons of war, he held constant maneuvers of the men under arms, and competitive drills. Indeed, he devised the compact order and the equipment of the phalanx, imitating the close order fighting, with overlapping shields of the warriors at Troy, and was first to organize the Macedonian phalanx. Diodorus Siculus. Armed with this potent new weapon, he sought to make war against the Illyrians, and put an end to that seemingly perpetual threat to Macedon once and for all. Diodorus relays the battle. And since the Illyrians were still left as enemies, he was ambitious to defeat them in war also. So, having quickly called an assembly and exhorted his soldiers for the war in a fitting speech, he led an expedition into the Illyrian territory, having no less than 10,000 foot soldiers and 600 horsemen. Bartolus, the king of the Illyrians, having learned of the presence of the enemy, relying upon his previous victories and the gallant conduct of the Illyrians, came out to meet the enemy with his army, and he had 10,000 picked infantry soldiers and about 500 cavalry. When the armies approached each other, and with a great outcry clashed in the battle, Philip, commanding the right wing, which consisted of the flower of the Macedonians serving under him, ordered his cavalry to ride past the ranks of the barbarians and attack them on the flank, while he himself, falling on the enemy in a frontal assault, began bitter combat. But the Illyrians, forming themselves into a square, courageously entered the fray, and at first, for a long while, the battle was evenly poised because of the exceeding gallantry displayed on both sides. And, as many were slain and still more wounded, the fortune of battle vacillated first one way, then the other, being constantly swayed by the valorous deeds of the combatants. But later, as the horsemen pressed on from the flank and rear, and Philip, with the flower of his troops, fought with true heroism, the mass of the Illyrians was compelled to take hastily to flight. When the pursuit had been kept up a considerable distance, and many had been slain in their flight, Philip recalled the Macedonians with trumpet and, erecting a trophy of victory, buried his own dead. While the Illyrians, having sent ambassadors and withdrawn from all the Macedonian cities, obtained peace, but more than 7,000 Illyrians were slain in this battle. Philip, having proved himself a competent warrior, was victorious. However, Philip was far from one-dimensional in his tactics of power acquisition. In addition to his military might, he utilized bribery, diplomacy, and a series of marriages to achieve his geopolitical ends. One such marriage was to the daughter of the king of the Molossians, the ruling tribe of neighboring Epirus, a people who, even in the eyes of the rustic Macedonians, were of an atavistic disposition, engaged in strange exotic customs, and practiced occult religion. Others say that the women of this country, having always been extremely addicted to the enthusiastic Orphic rites and the wild worship of Bacchus, upon which account they were called Clodines and Mimilones, imitated in many things the practice of the Edonian and Thracian women about Mount Haemus, from whom the word Threscuine seems to have been derived, as a special term for superfluous and over-curious forms of adoration, and that Olympius, zealously affecting these fanatical and enthusiastic inspirations to perform them with more barbaric dread, was wont in the dances proper to these ceremonies to have great tame serpents about her, which sometimes, creeping out of the ivy and the mystic fans, sometimes winding themselves about the sacred spears and the women's chaplets, made a spectacle which the men could not look upon without terror. Philip, being in Samothrace when he was quite young, fell in love there with Olympias, in company with whom he was initiated in the religious ceremonies of the country, and her father and mother being both dead, soon after, with the consent of her brother Arimbus, he married her. Plutarch, The Life of Alexander. Next, employing a newly refined tactic, Philip conquered Amphipolis through a well-executed siege. The Macedonian army's proficiency in siege warfare was another profound military innovation of Philip's. Previously, the Greeks had rarely resorted to sacking cities in their conflicts due to the lack of an effective method. This strategic edge would prove invaluable for Alexander in the campaigns that lay ahead. About the same time, Philip, king of the Macedonians, who had been victorious over the Illyrians in a great battle and had made subject all the people who dwelt there as far as the lake called Lycnitis, now returned to Macedonia, having arranged a noteworthy peace with the Illyrians, and won great acclaim among the Macedonians for the success due to his valor. Thereupon, finding that the people of Amphipolis were ill-disposed toward him and offered many pretexts for war, he entered upon a campaign against them with a considerable force. By bringing siege engines against the walls and launching severe and continuous assaults, he succeeded in breaching a portion of the wall with his battering rams, whereupon, having entered the city through the breach and struck down many of his opponents, he obtained the mastery of the city and exiled those who were disaffected toward him, but treated the rest considerately. Since this city was favorably situated with regard to Thrace and the neighboring regions, it contributed greatly to the aggrandizement of Philip. Diodorus Siculus. The next domino to fall was the town of Cronides. He seized control of their gold mines, exploited them efficiently, and built up a bountiful war chest with which he could fund his substantial military and political ambitions. As Diodorus tells us, after this he went to the city of Cronides, and having increased its size with a large number of inhabitants, changed its name to Philippi, giving it his own name, and then, turning to the gold mines in its territory, which were very scanty and insignificant, he increased their output so much by his improvements that they could bring him a revenue of more than 1,000 talents. And because, from these mines, he had soon amassed a fortune, with the abundance of money, he raised the Macedonian kingdom higher and higher to a greatly superior position. For with the gold coins which he struck, which came to be known from his name as Philippioi, he organized a large force of mercenaries, and by using these coins for bribes, induced many Greeks to become betrayers of their native lands. Ever the opportunist, Philip next used political turmoil in neighboring Thessaly as a pretext to intervene, and in doing so, gain a foothold in Thessalian politics. Again, Diodorus says, in Greece, Alexander, tyrant of Pherai, was assassinated by his own wife, Thebe, and her brothers, Lycophron and Tisiphonus. The brothers at first received great acclaim as tyrannicides, but later, having changed their purpose and bribed the mercenaries, they disclosed themselves as tyrants, slew many of their opponents, and, having contrived to make their forces imposing, retained the government by force. Now the faction among the Thessalians, called Aleuadi, who enjoyed a far-flung reputation by reason of their noble birth, began to oppose the tyrants. But, Not being of sufficient strength to fight by themselves, they took on Philip, the king of the Macedonians, as ally. And he, entering Thessaly, defeated the tyrants and, when he had vindicated the independence of their cities, showed himself very friendly to the Thessalians. Wherefore, in the course of subsequent events, not merely Philip himself, but his son, Alexander, after him, had the Thessalians always as confederates. According to the historian Justin, Philip's interest in Thessaly extended beyond mere influence. He coveted their renowned horses and cavalry, aiming to introduce a dynamic new dimension to Macedonian warfare. This strategic shift marked a departure from conventional Greek warfare, which, aside from the Thebans, as stated, had been centered on contests of heavy infantry. Philip knew he could make great use of the Thessalian cavalry. His already established companion cavalry was constituted of Macedonian aristocrats. They were heavily armored with a ziston, a lance with a spearhead at each end, and unlike the previous more general cavalry of the Greek world, which partook in recon, screening the movements of the main army, and pursuing a routed enemy, the companions were a highly specialized shock force, whose purpose was to strike the enemy at the flank or an exposed point in the line and break them. They were lined up on the right flank of the Hypaspists, and would wait patiently at the highest position of honor in the army for the phalangists to pin the enemy infantry in place, and when their opponents began to falter, or a gap opened up in their ranks, at the decisive point in the battle, they would charge in their trademark wedge formation, break the enemy at its weak point, and achieve victory. This was known as the hammer and anvil tactic, with the phalanx serving as the anvil and the companions as the hammer. However, in order to have the freedom to be used in such an offensive manner, the companion cavalry needed a more flexible counterpart, one that could attack and defend, and keep the left flank safe from the enemy's own cavalry, no less determined to turn the flank and annihilate the phalanx than the Macedonians themselves. For this purpose, Philip knew he could make great use of the Thessalian cavalry. The famous Thessalian cavalry had been most notably utilized by Jason of Pherae, the tyrant of Pherae, who, with his potent army of mercenaries, along with, crucially, this unrivaled band of horses, brought all of Thessaly under his subjugation, and won the title Tagus, the name for the chief magistrate in Thessaly, before his assassination put a premature end to his ambitions. The Thessalian cavalry rode in rhomboid formation, which allowed for them to change direction at speed, in contrast to the more single-minded and direct purpose of the companions' wedge formation. They would be deployed, as was stated, on the left flank of Philip's phalangists, and as the most intense attack typically came from the enemy's right side, which was constituted of his best troops, the Thessalian cavalry routinely took part in the hardest fighting on the battlefield, and were expected to hold out against the absolute best the enemy could offer. It took a cavalry of such pedigree and notoriety as the Thessalians to consistently rise to this brutal challenge. Although they were more generalized and adaptable than the companions, the Thessalians were still heavy cavalry. The role of light cavalry was served by the prodromoi. They would perform recon and screening roles, as well as, in pitched battles, protect the far flanks of either side of the army. The heavy cavalry, those being the companions and the Thessalian contingent, were themselves vulnerable to being flanked, particularly if the ground was uneven or the battlefield was edged by forests or terrain not fit for horses, which is why peltists were stationed on their flanks to protect them, as well as fight off any opposing light infantry that might come forward and throw javelins at the heavy cavalry, attempting to disrupt their formation before it was appropriate to engage, which would thwart the Macedonian strategy. With the addition of the Thessalians, here is what a typical battle formation of the Macedonian army looked like. It was a highly sophisticated combined arms force, something extremely novel by the standards of the day, with each unit serving an important role which greatly accentuated their fellow units' strengths and obscured their weaknesses. As Justin says, he thus incorporated a force of horse and foot in one invincible army. After this, Philip thwarted a plot hatched by his neighbors to come together in an alliance and stamp out the growing power of Macedon. This was easily countered. In Macedon, 3 kings combined against Philip, the kings of the Thracians, Paeonians, and Illyrians. For these peoples, inasmuch as they bordered upon Macedonia, eyed with suspicion the aggrandizement of Philip. Singly, however, they were not capable of sustaining a combat, each having suffered a defeat in the past. But they supposed that, if they should join their forces in a war, they would easily have the better of Philip. So it was that, while they were still gathering their armies, Philip appeared before their dispositions were made, struck terror into them, and compelled them to join forces with the Macedonians. Diodorus Siculus. Thus far, he had dealt with the affairs of man, but soon he would be compelled to act on behalf of a god. For in Greece, to his south, the Third Sacred War had begun. The Third Sacred War was a complicated affair, but it was mainly the result of the Phocians using land that belonged to the Temple of Apollo at Delphi for their own agricultural ends. Thebes, the regional hegemon and the protector of the Amphictyonic League, the body which was tasked with the governance of the temple, demanded that the Phocians pay a fine for their sacrilege. When they did not discharge the assessments, the Hieronemones of the Amphictyons brought charges against the Phocians and demanded of the council that if the Phocians did not pay the money to the god, they should lay under a curse the land of those who were cheating the god. Likewise, they declared that the others against whom judgments had been passed should discharge their fines, and if they did not obey, they should incur the common hatred of the Greeks for their knavery. Diodorus Siculus. The Phocians refused and seized the holy site at Delphi, home of the world-famous oracle, in response. Accusations of atrocity and profanation followed. The Spartans also owed a fine to the Thebans as a consequence of their defeat at Leuctra, with stiff indemnities being part of the terms of peace. The Phocians, recognizing this, promised to erase the Spartan debts as well should they join them, and should their side prevail. Persuaded, the Spartans indeed joined the Phocian cause. The Athenians, for reasons purely of realpolitik, sided with the Phocians as well, mostly to counterbalance their regional rivals, the Thebans. Diodorus would excoriate those who joined the Phocians with the following words: "Such now was the conduct of the Athenians toward the divine powers, and that too though they boasted that Apollo was their tutelary god and progenitor, and the Lacedaemonians, though they had consulted the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, and through it come to possess their constitution, which is admired of all the world, though even now they still interrogate the god on matters of supreme importance, had the effrontery to become partners in crime of those who had pillaged the sanctuary." The rest of Greece was outraged for the attack on the sacred site of Apollo, and were further incensed when the leader, or strategos autocrator of the Phocians, Philomelus, compelled, by force, that the oracle of Apollo declare that he now had authority over Delphi, and further still, when he pilfered the treasury of the oracle to hire more mercenaries. Diodorus explains, "When Philomelus had control of the oracle, he directed the Pythia to make her prophecies from the tripod in the ancestral fashion. But when she replied that such was not the ancestral fashion, he threatened her harshly and compelled her to mount the tripod. Then, when she frankly declared, referring to the superior power of the man who was resorting to violence, 'It is in your power to do as you please,' he gladly accepted her utterance and declared that he had the oracle which suited him. He immediately had the oracle inscribed and set it up in full view, and made it clear to everyone that the god gave him the authority to do as he pleased. Having got together an assembly and disclosed the prophecy to the multitude, and urged them to be of good cheer, he turned to the business of war. There came to him an omen as well, in the temple of Apollo, namely an eagle, which, after flying over the temple of the god and swooping down to the earth, preyed upon the pigeons which were maintained in the temple precincts, some of which it snatched away from the very altars. Those versed in such matters declared that the omen indicated to Philomelus and the Phocians that they would control the affairs of Delphi. Now no men of honorable character enrolled for the campaign because of their reverence for the gods, but the worst knaves, and those who despised the gods because of their own greed, eagerly gathered about Philomelus, and quickly a strong army was formed, out of those whose object it was to plunder the shrine. So Philomelus, because of the magnitude of his resources, soon had prepared a considerable army. Eventually, Philomelus was killed in a skirmish with the Thebans, and the Phocians faced a decision whether to take the opportunity to pursue détente or to double down and continue with the war. A man named Onomarchus would step in to fill the void in leadership Philomelus's death left. He proved to be even more of a hardliner and firebrand than Philomelus himself. Now that the Boeotians were of the opinion that the fate of Philomelus, who was chiefly responsible for the plundering of the temple, and who had been punished by gods and men, would deter the rest from like villainy. They returned to their own country. But the Phocians, now freed from the war, for the present returned to Delphi, and there, meeting with their allies in a common assembly, deliberated on the war. The moderate parties inclined toward the peace, but the irreligious, the hot-headed, and the avaricious were of the opposite opinion, and were looking around to find the proper spokesman to support their lawless aims. When Onimarchus arose and delivered a carefully argued speech urging them to adhere to their original purpose, he swung the sentiment of the gathering toward war. Though he did so, not so much with the intention of consulting the common welfare, as with a view to his own interests, for he had been sentenced frequently and severely by the Amphictyons in the same manner as the rest, and had not discharged the fines. Accordingly, seeing that war was more desirable for himself than peace, he quite logically urged the Phocians and their allies to adhere to the project of Philomelus. Having been chosen general with supreme command, he began to collect a large number of mercenaries, and, filling the gaps in his ranks caused by the casualties, and having increased his army by the large number of foreigners enrolled, he set about making great preparations of allies and of everything else that is serviceable for war. He was greatly encouraged in this undertaking by a dream, which gave intimation of great increase of power and glory. In his sleep, namely, it seemed that he was remodeling with his own hands the bronze statue which the Amphictyons had dedicated in the temple of Apollo, making it much taller and larger. He accordingly assumed that a sign was being given to him from the gods, that there would be an increase of glory because of his services as general. Onimarchus, when he had been chosen general in supreme command, prepared a great supply of weapons from the bronze and iron, and having struck coinage from the silver and gold, distributed it among the allied cities, and chiefly gave it as bribes to the leaders of those cities. Indeed, he succeeded in corrupting many of the enemy too, some of whom he persuaded to fight on his side, and others he required to maintain the peace. He easily accomplished everything because of man's greed. In his dealings with the Phocians, he also arrested and executed those who opposed him, and confiscated their property. After invading the territory of the enemy, he took Thronion by storm, and reduced its inhabitants to slavery, and, having intimidated the Amphictyons by threats, he forced them to submit. He sacked the city of the Dorians, and ravaged their territory. He invaded Boeotia, captured Orchomenus. So, under the pugnacious leadership of Onimarchus, Delphi was still irreverently and irreligiously held. The wrath of the god, who maintained an aspect known as the Destroyer, had been provoked. Two of the greater powers, those being Athens and Sparta, now standing against them, Thebes was impelled to solicit the help of Philip. Philip had his eye on Greece over the years, for never-ending conflict between the once illustrious city-states, including the Peloponnesian War, Corinthian War, the war between Thebes and Sparta, among others, had degraded their condition and blunted their former power. As Justin says, Philip had been looking down, as from a watchtower, for the opportunity to attack their liberties. In the name of Apollo, he came down from the north. Soon he came face to face with the impious Onimarchus and his Phocians in 353 or 352 BC at the Battle of Crocus Field. Diodorus sets the scene. Philip had just at that time returned with his army from Macedonia and had taken the field against Lycophron, tyrant of Pherae. Lycophron, however, since he was no match for him in strength, summoned reinforcements from his allies, the Phocians, promising jointly with them to organize the government of all Thessaly. So, when Onimarchus in haste came to his support with 20,000 foot and 500 horse, Philip, having persuaded the Thessalians to prosecute the war in common, gathered them all together, numbering more than 20,000 foot and 3,000 horse. Justin reports that Philip made his troops adorn their heads in crowns of laurel as if they were led by Apollo himself rather than Philip, and by this ornamented action proclaim themselves the avengers of God, their king the most zealous among them. This, however, was not the first time Philip's life had intersected with the gods. For very near the beginning of the outbreak of the Third Sacred War, a son to him was born of Olympius, and the signs and portents which marked his birth suggested nothing less than the involvement of divinity. It is agreed on by all hands that on his father's side Alexander descended from Hercules by Carinus, and from Aesus by Neoptolemus on the mother's side. The night before the consummation of their marriage, she dreamed that a thunderbolt fell upon her body, which kindled a great fire, whose divided flames dispersed themselves all about, and then were extinguished. And Philip, some time after he was married, dreamt that he sealed up his wife's body with a seal, whose impression, as he fancied, was the figure of a lion. Some of the diviners interpreted this as a warning to Philip to look narrowly to his wife, but Aristander of Telmessus, considering how unusual it was to seal up anything that was empty, assured him the meaning of his dream was that the queen was with child of a boy, who would one day prove as stout and courageous as a lion. Once, moreover, a serpent was found lying by Olympias as she slept, which more than anything else, it is said, abated Philip's passion for her. And whether he feared her as an enchantress, or thought she had commerce with some god, and so looked on himself as excluded, he was ever after less fond of her conversation. Philip, after this vision, sent Chiron of Megalopolis to consult the oracle of Apollo at Delphi, by which he was commanded to perform sacrifice, and henceforth pay particular honor, above all other gods, to Ammon, and was told that he should one day lose that eye, with which he presumed to peep through the chink of the door, when he saw the god under the form of a serpent in the company of his wife. Plutarch, The Life of Alexander. Merely a year later, he would indeed lose that eye. Philip, perceiving that the people of Metheny were permitting their city to become a base of operations for his enemies, began a siege. And although for a time the people of Metheny held out, later, being overpowered, they were compelled to hand the city over to the king on the terms that the citizens should leave Metheny with a single garment each. Philip then razed the city and distributed its territory among the Macedonians. In this siege, it so happened that Philip was struck in the eye by an arrow and lost the sight of that eye. Diodorus Siculus. Now, at Crocus Field, the laureled Macedonians descended mercilessly on the Phocians. A severe battle took place, and since the Thessalian cavalry were superior in numbers and valor, Philip won. Because Onomarchus had fled toward the sea, and Chares the Athenian was by chance sailing by with many triremes, a great slaughter of the Phocians took place. For the men, in their effort to escape, would strip off their armor and try to swim out to the triremes, and among them was Onomarchus. Finally, more than 6,000 of the Phocians and mercenaries were slain, and among them the general himself, and no less than 3,000 were taken captives. Philip hanged Onomarchus. The rest he threw into the sea as temple robbers. Diodorus Siculus. This was the fate of the Phocian force, with Justin claiming that the slaughter Philip unleashed on them, those who suffered greatly in their deaths, was divine retribution for their temerity to contest with a god. Diodorus goes into more detail still, saying, "Some of the Phocians straightway fled to the nearest cities and dispersed, while others took refuge in the temple of Apollo and perished to the number of 500. Now many other divine visitations fell to the lot of the Phocians about this period, and in particular the one I am about to relate. The men who had taken refuge in the temple supposed that their lives would be saved through the intervention of the gods. But on the contrary, through some divine providence, they met with the punishment temple robbers well deserve. For there was a quantity of rushes about the temple, and a fire had been left behind in the tents of the men who had fled, with the result that the rushes caught fire, and such a great conflagration was touched off so miraculously that the temple was consumed, and the Phocians who had fled to it for refuge were burnt alive. Indeed, it became apparent that the gods do not extend to temple robbers the protection generally accorded to suppliants. These acts of retributive martial piety made Philip the most glorious man in all of Greece. Philip, after his defeat of Onomarchus in a noteworthy battle, put an end to the tyranny in Pherae, and, after restoring its freedom to the city and settling all other matters in Thessaly, advanced to Thermopylae, intending to make war on the Phocians. But since the Athenians prevented him from penetrating the pass, he, eventually, returned to Macedonia, having enlarged his kingdom not only by his achievements, but also by his reverence toward the god. Diodorus Siculus. The final defeat of the remnants of the Phocian forces was completed without even fighting a battle. So thoroughly had Philip vanquished, disheartened, and demoralized his enemies with his previous actions. With the sacred war finally ended, Philip would claim, and indeed be offered, the former powers of the now subdued Phocians, and he reaped the material and intangible rewards of the victorious. He gained great influence in the Amphictyonic Council, and also gained the right, and the prestige that went along with it, to patronize the Pythian Games. Philip, after taking over the Thessalians, entered Locris with a large army. When he had overtaken Philipus, who had again been granted the generalship and the main body of the mercenaries, Philip prepared to decide the war by a pitched battle. But Philipus, who was tarrying in Nicaea and saw that he was no match for Philip, sent ambassadors to the king to treat for an armistice. An agreement was reached whereby Philipus with his men should depart whithersoever he wished, and he then, under the terms of the truce, withdrew to the Peloponnese with his mercenaries to the number of 8,000. But the Phocians, whose hopes were now completely crushed, surrendered to Philip. The king, having without a battle unexpectedly terminated the sacred war, sat in council with the Boeotians and the Thessalians. As a result, he decided to call a meeting of the Amphictyonic Council and leave to it the final decision on all the issues at stake. The members of the council then passed a decree admitting Philip and his descendants to the Amphictyonic Council, and according him 2 votes, which formerly had been held by the Phocians, now defeated in war. They also voted that the 3 cities in the possession of the Phocians should have their walls removed, and that the Phocians should have no participation in the shrine of Delphi or in the council of the Amphictyons, that they should not be permitted to acquire either horses or arms until they should have repaid to the god the monies they had pillaged, that those of the Phocians who had fled, and any others who had had a share in the robbing the sanctuary, were to be under a curse, and subject to arrest wherever they might be, that all the cities of the Phocians were to be razed, and the men moved to villages, no one of which should have more than 50 houses, and the villages were to be not less than a stade distant from one another, that the Phocians were to possess their territory, and to pay each year to the god a tribute of 60 talents, until they should have paid back the sums entered in the registers at the time of the pillaging of the sanctuary. Philip, furthermore, was to hold the Pythian Games together with the Boeotians and the Thessalians, since the Corinthians had shared with the Phocians in the sacrilege committed against the god. The Amphictyons and Philip were to hurl the arms of the Phocians and their mercenaries down the crags, and burn what remained of them, and to sell the horses. In similar tenor, the Amphictyons laid down regulations for the custody of the oracle, and other matters affecting due respect for the gods, and the general peace and concord of the Greeks. Diodorus Siculus. All of this gain he plotted to utilize in the near future, for his ambitions, Diodorus acknowledges, extended beyond the mere confines of Greece. Thereafter, when Philip had helped the Amphictyons give effect to their decrees and had dealt courteously with all, he returned to Macedonia, having not merely won for himself a reputation for piety and excellent generalship, but having also made important preparations for the aggrandizement that was destined to be his. For he was ambitious to be designated general of Hellas in supreme command, and as such, to prosecute the war against the Persians. As for Apollo, with his temple and representative on earth now liberated, and the Phocians at their most wretched in their total defeat, the unforgiving god now meted out his judgment upon the actors in this drama. But first, it is only right, so we think, to record the punishment which was visited by the gods upon those who had committed the outrage on the oracle. For, speaking generally, it was not merely the perpetrators of the sacrilege, but all persons who had the slightest connections with the sacrilege that were hounded by the inexorable retribution sent of heaven. In fact, the man who had first schemed for the seizure of the shrine, Philomelus, in a crisis of the war, hurled himself over a cliff, while his brother Onomarchus, after taking over the command of his people, now become desperate, was cut to pieces in a battle in Thessaly, along with the Phocians and mercenaries of his command, and was hanged or crucified. The third in succession, and the one who coined into money most of the dedications, Phalus, fell ill of a lingering disease, and so was unable even to secure a quick release from his punishment. And last of all, Phalesus, who had gathered the remnants of the pillaged property, passed his life for a considerable length of time wandering about in great fear and danger, though it was not heaven's intent that he should be happier than those who participated with him in the sacrilege, but that, by being tortured longer, and by becoming known to many for his misfortunes, his sad fate might become notorious. The wives of the Phocian commanders who had worn the gold necklaces taken from Delphi met with punishment befitting their impiety. For one of them, who had worn the chain which had belonged to Helen of Troy, sank to the shameful life of a courtesan, and flung her beauty before any who chose wantonly to abuse it. And another, who put on the necklace of Euryphile, had her house set on fire by her eldest son in a fit of madness, and was burned alive in it. Thus, those who had the effrontery to flout the deity met just retribution in the manner I have described at the hands of the gods, while Philip, who rallied to the support of the oracle, added continually to his strength from that time on, and finally, because of his reverence for the gods, was appointed commander of all Hellas and acquired for himself the largest kingdom in Europe. Diodorus Siculus. The gods had indeed chosen who they would destroy, but they had, it seems, also chosen who they would bless. Alexander was born on the 6th of Hecatomeon, which month the Macedonians call Luce, the same day that the temple of Diana at Ephesus was burnt, which Hegesias of Magnesia makes the occasion of a conceit frigid enough to have stopped the conflagration. The temple, he says, took fire and was burnt while its mistress was absent, assisting at the birth of Alexander. And all the eastern soothsayers, who happened to be then at Ephesus, looking upon the ruin of this temple to be the forerunner of some other calamity, ran about the town, beating their faces and crying that this day had brought forth something that would prove fatal and destructive to all Asia. Just after, Philip received these 3 messages at one time: that Parmenion had overthrown the Illyrians in a great battle, that his racehorse had won the course at the Olympic Games, and that his wife had given birth to Alexander, with which, being naturally well pleased, as an addition to his satisfaction, was assured by the diviners that a son, whose birth was accompanied with 3 such successes, could not fail of being invincible. Plutarch, The Life of Alexander. Next time, Philip and the young Alexander team up to take on the most famous Greek city of them all, Athens. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.